Mornings. May the Lord bless each and every one of you. At this time, while I get my notes ready, if you could greet one another right beside you, just say, "May the Lord bless you this morning." You look marvelous. The Lord is good, indeed, at this time. Okay, we're balanced up here? Are we balanced? Okay, good. All right, let's all rise. We'll read from Scripture, short reading today, verses 1 to 7 from Exodus 17. Reading from the ESV. And I will start with verse 1, and we'll alternate with verse 2 from the congregation. Here we go. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go." And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" You may be seated. Many of these stories from the book of Exodus may seem familiar to you, especially if you grew up in church. If you've been around Sunday schools, you hear stories of the Israelites in slavery, of the plagues which come and declare judgment over Egypt, of the death of a firstborn, of the Passover being instituted by the blood covering the doorposts of houses, and the angel of death passing over. You hear stories of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. You remember the story where Moses would take the staff and strike the Red Sea. The sea would part, and miraculously, this entire host of Israel, by some accounts well over 1 million people, would cross through on dry land. You hear things about the stories where they would come to a place where the waters are bitter and undrinkable, and yet somehow God, with his divine authority and power, would make those bitter waters sweet, even blessing his people in the midst of their complaints. And that when the people are hungry, again complaining and grumbling, God would provide miraculously with manna and quail. The Sunday school stories are very important. They are foundational to what we believe. They're part of the bedrock of our faith. But as we've been studying the book of Exodus, we realize they're more than just stories. The lessons we learn about who we are as God's people must not be forgotten. But even more importantly, and most importantly, these stories point to the identity and the character of God. Our God of mercy, our God of provision, the God who saved us. and also the God who leads us during our times of trial and during our times of desert and wilderness. And here we reach a pinnacle of the book of Exodus. You might have thought it was the plagues. You might have thought it was the Passover, which is very important. Let us not forget. You might have thought it was the Red Sea being parted. But I would argue that here we see actually a very clear picture of the redemption of God's people. A clearer picture of what actually happens in the throne room of God. It's somewhat of a courtroom scene. This is very interesting. We have a very well-educated congregation here. Many of you will go on to be doctors. Some of you are there already. Many of you will go on to be engineers and work in large companies or do all sorts of other things, research. There's so much potential here. It's kind of crazy when I think about it. A bit of an aside this morning, but I feel so blessed to be your pastor for this period of your life, because I know so many of you will go on to do amazing things. Not that that determines your worth, because you're children of God. Every single one of you, God cares for and has an amazing plan for in His eyes. But just part of me with a pastoral and somewhat fatherly heart. You want to see your children go on and do good things. But one thing we don't have much of here in this congregation is we don't have too many lawyers. I don't know if it's the programs at Pitt or CMU or whatnot, but that's like one of the chosen three for Asian parents, is it not? A doctor, lawyer. We don't have too many, and so this might seem a little bit foreign this morning. But when you look at what's happening here in Exodus 17, most of us, especially those of us who are engineer-minded, you're like, how can you get water from the top of a rock? You got to go down near the ground and drill down to get water. Most of us, we look at the water. We think about geology. We think about God's amazing provision by providing water for grumbling, thirsty people. Yes, that is part of the story. But if you pay close attention, this is a courtroom scene. Why do I say so? Because of the emphasis on the staff or the rod, which in ancient times is always an image or a symbol of power, authority, and judgment. A rod or a staff is what the judge would carry when he is about to carry out a sentence on a person or a people. You see this language of people sitting and people standing in a courtroom when you take the stand, right? It's right there in the word. It's the stand. You stand before a magistrate to wait for your sentencing. And so when we look at this in God's courtroom, we see three things. Up until this point, we've seen God's patience with His people. Pay close attention. First slide, please. Pay close attention. God's people, if you remember, they're grumbling, they're complaining. They don't even want to follow Moses. They say to Moses, "Why have you given us even more hard work? It's because of what you've done that Pharaoh's making things harder for us." They tell us to make more bricks with less straw and less mud. You've put even more burden on our back, Moses. If I was Moses, I'd be like, okay, fine then, just stay in your slavery. I'll go to Pharaoh and just say, we'll do this way, and he'll give you your straw back. But no, Moses follows through. God follows through. The people are redeemed. They're saved. They're pulled out of slavery. And what's the very first thing they do when they're in the desert? they complain. They get to the Red Sea, they complain. They get to a place where there are waters, they complain, they grumble. They're hungry, they grumble, they complain again. What'd you bring us out here for? To die? The patience of God. God had every right. Remember, He is supreme. He didn't have to redeem those people. But where they were, He had compassion. He said, my character is true. And He saved them where they were. But we do realize as well there is a penalty. We'll go a little bit more in depth into this, but whenever there is a judgment passed, a penalty must be paid. And I'm giving away the sermon right here, but there's also a provision. So if an injustice occurs, a judgment is passed, a penalty must be paid. How are you going to pay it? We realize that the penalty against, or the penalty that God has to pay for the wages of sin, it is pretty extreme. For the wages of sin is what? It's death. So you see a foreshadowing of what is to come here in this courtroom scene. Moving back to the first point with patience, Exodus 17, verse 1. All the congregation of the people moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord. So every step that they took, every place that they went, by stages, according to God's plan. Just kind of pausing there for a bit. That's kind of hard for some of us to digest at times, is it not? Wait, God, can't you just change me right now, in an instant? God, I just want to lie here and just have you operate on me, and when I wake up, I'm going to be the new me, the new person, the person that is perfectly fit to follow you. It's the way a lot of us want our spirituality. But God takes His people from place to place, trial to trial, tribulation to tribulation, step by step through this wilderness in stages, according to His command. And they come to Rephidim, and again, there is no water for people to drink. And so by this time, if you were a good child, if you were even a thinking person, you might, sit down and pause and breathe in and breathe out and realize we've been in a similar situation before. And what happened in that last situation? God provided. What happened in that last situation? God saved His people. He gave them exactly what they needed, and at times even more. And so time after time after time, this has happened to God's people. They get into a rough situation. They start to panic. They cry out to God. Then what does God do? God delivers them. God provides for them. And here they are, one more situation. Sound pretty familiar? Many of us are the same way, are we not, in our Christian walk? God provides for us. We're like, hooray, God, thank you so much. You're so amazing. I will praise you. I will worship you. Life comes at us again. Things become very difficult. And what do? We start to fret. We start to worry. We get anxious. We get depressed. We fall down. Some of us even want to walk away. And God provides. Time and time and time again, we go through this in our own spiritual walks. But this is something extraordinary. something extraordinary is going to happen this time around. If you remember the waters at Marah, yes, they were bitter, and some people don't know, and I was asked this actually at a Bible study, whether or not they were just really bitter and hard to drink, or they just couldn't be drunk at all. Because if they couldn't be drunk at all, then they were in danger of death, and it makes it a little bit more pertinent to get fresh water. But here, at this time, there is absolutely no water. It might seem a little more bleak. And the people, they quarrel with Moses. And here's another place where I think many English translations fall a little bit short. The word quarrel. Because the word quarrel here, it's not just grumble, it's not just complain, it's bringing a charge forth. Again, it's one of those courtroom terms. And when theologians look at this, or someone who knows their Hebrew, or even a Jewish person who studied this stuff growing up, would look at this, they would know immediately here is a courtroom scene. A charge is being brought forth. They're accusing Moses, maybe even of premeditated murder. Look at the language here. You're going to bring us out here to die? You brought us out here to kill us with thirst? They're charging Moses with a heinous crime. And a judgment will take place. The same thing to do for the Israelites would have been just to trust God. But instead, they bring charges forth against Moses. But we read earlier in Exodus that when you charge God's leaders in that way, who are walking faithfully, who have delivered on God's promises time after time after time, who have stood before God and interceded on behalf of the people time after time after time. If you bring charges against those people, you're not just bringing charges against Moses and Aaron, you're bringing charges against God. And so why do you grumble against me? You're not just grumbling against me, you're grumbling against God. You're like terrible people, terrible Israelites. But again, we do this all the time as well, do we not? When we look at the injustices, when we look at the troubles and the hardships in our own lives, I do this all the time. Here's a confession. I was up really late last night working on my new bathroom in the upstairs